but I knew instantly that things weren't right. She asked me to come over, and she really embraced me and gave me a really meaningful, and I can still feel it to this day, that hug, man.
Yeah, wow.
Because I knew, little did I know that was going to be the last ever hug.
Yeah.
And not long after, she looked at me and we spoke, and she said that she was really proud, and she made the best decision of her life to adopt me, and she's proud to see where I've come from to who I was then, and for me to look after my brother, and she, I remember her last words, make the most of every opportunity you get. Wow. That's why we adopted you.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I
was just going to say, is that a real spark or an anchor for you, that moment, just to go wow, this woman has brought me over from the Philippines, and in her last words she said, make the most of every opportunity, and you kind of hold that true in your heart to go forward from there?
I live and breathe by those words every day.
Fantastic. Test, how's that for you, Jill? Hello, welcome to another episode of Going Pro, and we have a special guest today, Daniel Buberis. I just want to read out a little bit about what you've done, because I feel like you have a long itinerary here of what you've done and what you're continually doing, and I think you're going to provide a lot of value for our listeners today. So you started out as being a rehab assistant and business administration for Port Adelaide Football Club. You've been the senior strength and conditioning coach at Sturt Football Club. You've been the strength and conditioning coach at the South Australian Sport Institute. You've been involved in Tennis Australia as the professional men's and Australian Davis Cup senior physical performance coach, which is quite an achievement. You've worked in the National Academy senior physical performance as a coach. You've been the athletic development and rehab coordinator at Port Adelaide Football Club, medical rehab manager at Glenelg Football Club. You've started your own foundation helping disadvantaged kids in the Philippines, which I'm really keen to talk about, because I know you're super passionate about it. I think there's going to be some awesome takeaways from that. And currently you're the national men's beach volleyball physical preparation coach.
Bit of a mouthful there, mate. Yeah.
Yeah, far out. There's a long list. I feel like that's a podcast in itself. So welcome. Thanks for being here with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Luke. I'm really excited to be here, mate. So thanks for the opportunity. It seems like I've done a fair bit in that period of time, and a lot of variety and variation, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, you're one that came to my mind when we started this podcast. I had a little bit to do with you through a mutual friend, Lee, and Eddie Winter, who's currently playing on the ITF and Challenger circuit. So just being around you, I loved your positive energy. You were someone that was always trying to get the most out of your athletes that you're working with. I could just tell you're someone that really wanted to provide a good service and help people. So for me, it was just a no-brainer to really hear about your story and see what value you could provide for our listeners or anyone that is listening to this podcast. So I guess where I want to start is you have a really interesting journey. You grew up in Whyalla, and you were adopted from two parents that are from Whyalla, and they brought you over. Where did you grow up? Where did you come from? Was it in
the Philippines?
Yeah. So I guess I want to find out a little bit more about what it was like for you in that time growing up there, because I'm guessing it would have been quite different, and you would have been culturally quite different to a lot of people growing up in Whyalla at the time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, mate, because it's one of those situations where you don't really reflect on it until you probably get a little bit older in life, partly because you've had so many experiences. And I think now that my circumstances have changed with having a family and particularly a young son now, you sort of by virtue of that reflect a little bit on the past, because I think that's quite important in terms of how you support and encourage your son as well. And for me, I was adopted in 1981 as a 4.5-year-old from the Philippines in Manila, in a province called Quezon City, which is about an hour and a half from Manila City. And I was adopted by an Australian couple, Peter and Judy Buberis, who were both from Whyalla, and obviously became my adoptive parents. My mother, Judy, was a hairdresser, and also an avid netballer and sports person all round. And my father was a reasonably good country footballer and enjoyed his other sports in cricket and fishing. And he actually grew up in Port Lincoln. So he came from a very rich, I guess, fishing family. And he became a lawyer and moved to Whyalla to set up his practice. And my mother, who was from Adelaide, and I think that's where my father met. My mother was in Adelaide, and then they decided to move to Whyalla. And it was around that point, not long after they got married, that they discovered that my adoptive mother, Judy, couldn't have children, unfortunately, children of her own. And it wasn't until one of Dad's best mates suggested the idea of perhaps adopting at that time. And look, I don't really understand what the landscape or perhaps the perception around adoption at that point in time, given that it was very early 80s, coming out of the 70s. There was a big migration shift, particularly from the Southeast Asian countries that were particularly going through conflict with Vietnam War and what have you, and around Cambodia.
Of course.
So there was this sort of movement of migration from those areas, and adoption was certainly was becoming a little bit more prevalent in some respects. And you may argue there was a bit of a stigma involved to it. And culturally, it was relatively new to Australia, whilst Australia was known for having a big European migration post-World War. The idea of having a large migration from Southeast Asia probably wasn't as forthcoming or widely accepted. Now, that might be a bit of a generalisation. So the idea of adopting from Southeast Asia probably wasn't necessarily on the radar immediately with my parents. And it was only years later that I did find out that my Dad's best mate, Peter, also named Peter, suggested the Philippines, just partly because, in fact, several Southeast Asian countries. And my understanding is at that point that the parents felt inclined to adopt from there, partly maybe because of the poverty that was, that they were experiencing, very much a third world or somewhat third world developing countries. And, there were a lot of adopted kids or orphan kids. So I think they probably felt compelled through compassion more than anything. And the need for my mother and my dad to, have a son of their own or a child of their own. So they made that decision to adopt from the Philippines of the other countries, which I understand might have been Cambodia and Korea potentially. They started that process. And by the way, all this information I've only just recently found out in terms of how that all sort of came about just through previous documentation.
Is there any reason why you didn't? You didn't want to know, or?
Well, that's probably, I can talk a bit more about that down the track, but for me, it's interesting because being adopted when I was growing up, and it depends on how you look at it, I was brought into a completely different culture from, different part of the world, didn't speak a language, I was malnourished, certainly very young, and here I was in a country town like Whyalla that was very much a blue-collar town, BHP's based there, and dare I say, very white. And, being one of the very few minority ethnic backgrounds, I didn't think any different at that point in time because, I was only 5 years old. So
this is just a quick note on our podcast sponsor. This podcast would not be possible without the support from 4RT. They are a creative house that helps businesses with their advertising, marketing, and content needs. If your business has a story to tell, then these guys can really help you with that story. And through ATA, they've helped us massively, and we trust these guys dearly, and we feel like they're the best in the business. So they could add a lot of value to your marketing and advertising needs.
I think the whole idea of the parents adopting was to sort of have that experience of, supporting a young kid from a different country, give him the life that perhaps he would not otherwise have through his unfortunate circumstances. And so that opportunity to bring me into that environment was there. And, it's funny because I went through that period in life, and just getting back to that point earlier was I never really connected with the Philippines. And I went all through junior school, high school, even early university, not really having a connection or I guess a desire or want for that matter. like I said from the beginning, it wasn't really until I had my son or got married that I started to really reflect on my heritage as such. And I was going through this sort of phase of identity. And, that identity was brought about the opportunities that I've had in life and how I came about to where I am now. And I was living a pretty good life, and I've had a good life. There's certainly no complaints about it. A privileged life, if you will, if you're talking in context with my previous life. So for me, that forced me to sort of reflect a bit. And so, I guess in the last probably 5 years, I've really been on this journey of self-discovery, trying to really connect with my heritage and feel internally, try and find a level of comfort, contentment, if you will. But also at the same time, there is a purpose behind it, and that purpose is to, I guess, build this catalogue of information that I never had or had knowledge of, because there was this sort of gaping hole early on in my life that I had absolutely no understanding, and that's who my biological parents are, what were the circumstances behind it. And so for me, it's about understanding that so I can actually pass that on to my son. I think it's very important, not just for my son, but I guess in general, that, your future children or your children should have an understanding of your parents' background, because it's how we develop as humans, how we build our own identity. Like yourself, no doubt you'd speak to your parents and they'd always tell you about their grandparents or their parents and their grandparents, about the heritage, and it's who we are. And so for me, this was just an opportunity, a very good opportunity to sort of explore that a little bit more, but also, I guess, unearth and perhaps rediscover some, past information that I wasn't aware of, just to sort of put the puzzles together. And I'm still going through that journey and that process, but it's an exciting one, because I don't feel any anxiety around it. I certainly feel a level of anticipation in terms of what can be or what can come of this. But also, I am protective of my own emotions in that I could be led to some disappointment. And I sometimes wonder, how will I deal with that if one day I do decide to find my biological parents? How might I manage my emotions in that state? So there are unknowns at the moment, but it's exciting. And that, I think, is a really important part of who I am in terms of, finding purpose in life. It has given me more of an outlook, more of a positive outlook around the whys of why am I here type thing. And these are all sort of, deep-hearted conversations, but I guess, this has all been accentuated over the years, partly because of my family and my son. So, and a lot of the experiences I've had in the past have shaped a lot of where I am today, as with most people. And it's all about, I guess, finding meaning as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And really from there, it's then honouring that. And, it's funny because I guess a lot of what I'm going through isn't too unfamiliar with a lot of adoptees. And a lot of it is about finding identity. It's also realising, or which is, I guess, being activated by the opportunities you've had in life, because you do realise that when you are adopted, that you are given and presented with many opportunities, because you are adopted by wealthy people or by well-off people who come from quite middle-class families. So you are going to be presented with opportunities in life. As simple and as easy as it may sound, it's not, because you've been removed from a cultural environment that you were born in to then into an environment that is culturally different, and you do stand out as the different person. And I think for me, and I'm not looking for pity here, but for me, I knew I was different.
Yeah.
I only need to look back at a lot of my school photos, and I was the only Asian kid there, or let alone the only Asian adopted kid amongst all of my friends. So, but I use a lot of these experiences and analogies to sort of try and instill in my athletes, because, whilst they're on different levels of the spectrum, there are parallels in terms of athletes trying to find identity of who they are as an athlete, but also encouraging athletes to realise the opportunities that they've been given and, learn to value those opportunities. And I think that's what really drives us, or drives athletes, is that, once they sort of discover that, and that discovery just doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process, but it's also a process of direction and support and attention with that particular athlete to help nurture them through that, because the penny does drop, particularly for those that are in stable environments, that they do realise suddenly, I have this wonderful opportunity, I'm going to make the most of it. And it can quite literally turn overnight, and suddenly athletes have these little bursts of performance outcomes that just elevate them to the next level. And you see that a lot. And each to their own, each has their own triggers and reasonings. And I think really, I guess in my role these days, it's more about identifying that with the athlete and then nurturing that and then working with that along with their team, whether it's in an individual team, i.e. tennis, or as a collective team, as in a football team. So I've used a lot of my experiences, particularly in the last 5-6 years, to really sort of connect my experiences to what perhaps the athlete is going through. And for me, that builds a really good relationship. I think it also allows me to be a little bit vulnerable to the athlete.
Yeah, absolutely.
Show
That's
them,
important.
It is, yeah, to show the more humanistic side, and to not only the humanistic side of the relationship, but the humanistic side of the journey of trying to become an elite athlete. Because it's not all, it's not a straight road. It's certainly not a straight road at all. And so, so it's an interesting one. And look, I think with my early experiences growing up, we talk about a whole heap of things around building resilience and building confidence and self-efficacy, a belief in your skill, building confidence. And I guess ultimately what it is, it's somehow trying to socially fit into a particular demographics, whether that's in a sporting population or whether it's just in a normal workplace or school or university population. So for me, I went through that process sort of blindfolded, to be honest, I think, as most kids do. And I think you do get to an age where the realisation of what's actually happening around you starts to become a little bit more prevalent, and you start to actually really start to connect. And look, I sadly lost my adoptive mother when I was 13.
Yeah, okay.
So having moved from Whyalla after living there for 4 or 5 years, we moved to Adelaide. Mm-hmm. And I started at Glen Osmond Primary School there. It might have been year 4. And then I went to Rostrevor College up there in the eastern suburbs, just on the foothills there. Mm-hmm. And I went to that school partly because my father was an old scholar there. It was also very much a sporting school, had a very rich history of sporting success, particularly with Australian rules football, footy. And my father was very well established at the school, having been an old scholar, but also being involved in sports committees and then on the school board when I started at Rostrevor. So I started there in 88, and by 1990, my mother passed away, or 1991, she passed away with cancer. I was in year 8. And it wasn't, again, until years later I found out she'd actually was diagnosed with cancer when I was in year 6. So, but I
was just going to say, how did you navigate that as a young teenager?
Yeah, look, as a young teenager, I was very much heavily involved in sport at that time.
Did that almost like save you as like
absolutely
as a way to get through that?
Yeah, absolutely it did. In the most simplest form, it was a distraction, but it was more or less delaying the inevitable. But for me, that distraction was great. And it kept me focused. It kept me integrated with a social group. It allowed me to develop really strong friendships. It allowed me to adopt some great skills. It allowed me to apply myself physically. And I enjoyed it. And, I have my father to thank for that, because he himself was a bit of a fitness fanatic, but he obviously came from a bit of a sporting background himself. So he was very encouraging, not overwhelmingly possessive in terms of, taking ownership of my sporting career, but more or less he pushed me, no doubt. But he also taught me some really valuable lessons. But during all of that, when my mother passed away, look, it was a confusing moment. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that I've also got an adoptive brother, also from the Philippines, Tom, who's 7 years younger than I am. And so there was a big age discrepancy, or age gap, I should say, between myself and my brother Tom, and then my father. So, we were living up in Crayford at the time, and Mum passed away sadly. And I'll never forget that day, because I think that day was a really turning point in terms of starting to realise who I was. Because I just lost, in my mind, another mother. So I felt empty, emotionally empty. I felt disconnected. And I'll never forget, because I was actually at home with a really good mate of mine, and my mother was down at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and I get this phone call, and she'd been in hospital for some time now. And she actually had a relapse from breast cancer, and she had just got back from an overseas trip, and the trip was cut off because she went back into relapse, I guess, with the cancer that had sort of re-emerged, and so which started this dramatic decline in her health. And so she was in hospital for a considerable amount of time. And I was at home, and my father rang me, and he said, look, you need to come down. And so I did on my own. And I remember walking onto the 5th floor of the Royal Adelaide Hospital late in the afternoon, and seeing her, in bed. And it was only a couple of days before that I'd seen her, and she was actually quite sprightly, up and about, and she was quite engaging. And but I knew instantly that things weren't right. She asked me to come over, and she really embraced me and gave me a really meaningful, and I can still feel it to this day, that hug, man.
Yeah, wow.
Because I knew, little did I know that was going to be the last ever hug.
Yeah.
And not long after, she looked at me, and we spoke, and she said that she was really proud, and she made the best decision of her life to adopt me, and she's proud to see where I've come from to who I was then, and for me to look after my brother, and I remember her last words, make the most of every opportunity you get. Wow. That's why we adopted you.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I
was just going to say, is that a real spark or an anchor for you, that moment, just to go wow, this woman has brought me over from the Philippines, and in her last words she said, make the most of every opportunity, and you kind of hold that true in your heart to go forward from there?
I live and breathe by those words every day.
Fantastic.
And I've learned to take those opportunities.
Yeah.
I've learned not to fear failure, to accept it. I've learned to get up when you get knocked down. I've learned to be myself over the years. But more importantly, I've also learned that life is so valuable, and it can be taken away in such a short amount of time. Yeah. But I've also learned that life does throw some massive challenges at you, and you can't get through life on your own. And when she passed away, moments after that, she was quite thirsty, and I gave her a sip of Pepsi, which of all things probably wasn't the ideal thing. And she took that and started to experience this. I don't know. She just sort of rapidly declined moments later, and then within 20 minutes she passed away. As a 13-year-old, you just don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And look, you got to understand, Google wasn't around then, so it's not like we had, the information for what cancer is and the effects of cancer at our fingertips. It was relatively new on a public scale in terms of information coming out of what breast cancer is and the effects of it, and the treatments. The treatments obviously were quite new at the time compared to what it is these days. So, in terms of early diagnosis or even just early identification, those measures weren't necessarily in place at that point. So these were all things, I just couldn't get my head around when it all happened. Like suddenly she was there and suddenly she's not, and suddenly I'm without a mother. So, I remember the day after, everything just felt really surreal. My father and I went for this huge walk around the Adelaide hills, and Dad was fantastic. He put his arm around me and said, we'll get through this. You're young. And he was really empathetic, but he was also obviously torn himself. Now he's got 2 adopted kids, or 2 kids of his own that he has to now look after. So, and we were pretty lucky. My dad's got a relatively close family, and so we had a lot of support, and particularly mum's friends and my school friends. So, through that period alone, whilst it was quite difficult, I felt very supported. But in saying that, things, I guess, started to manifest in terms of who I was. And, I went through this really angry phase.
Yeah.
I became
just angry at the world, of just like, why is this happening? And
angry because I didn't know what was going on or what everything meant. And I felt whether, and I certainly don't point the finger at my dad, but I just felt perhaps emotionally there wasn't an avenue there to talk to anyone in particular. My deepest concerns were probably more through naivety than anything about, what does this all mean? So,
especially in that time as well, like that time it would have been really like taboo to start talking about this sort of stuff, and wouldn't have been so readily available. Whereas now I think it's changing a lot, where it's starting to become a lot more acceptable to talk about these things, and there's people there to open up to, and it's I'd say a little bit easier for some people to navigate if they're going through that.
No, you make a really good point there, because I felt I can talk to anyone at that point, and no doubt there were people there that would have been willing to chat, but I just felt, I don't know, I became very closed off, certainly became very angry. Yeah. But in saying that, sport provided me that avenue, that distraction, and I gave it everything I had. And that was my saviour, to be honest.
Amazing.
I built some really good friendships. I was okay at sport, and, I just wanted to do the best. And as sad as it may sound, you don't want tragedy to be the one that ignites your passion and your purpose in life. But for me, it did. And it does to everyone else that's gone through that experience, tragic experience in their own way. But for me, I felt I have to make the most of this now. I really do. And I just committed to becoming the best at what I could do from a sporting sense. I was okay at footy, and I made the footy team, and, I really want to do that. But fortunately for me, after high school, that was where it was going to stop, because clearly the AFL wasn't going to take a 4'3". 4'3" little stump. But anyway, that's another story. So I had, and it's funny because I really embraced sport. I really thought I was a chance back then of playing AFL. Mm-hmm. I mean, you got to understand the average height of an AFL player probably isn't as tall, or was as tall as it is now. I mean, a midfielder's 195 centimetres on average, and a midfielder back then was about 172, 170. So I thought I was in a little chance. So once that little flame was extinguished, which was relatively soon after school, I was lost. And it's funny because I talk about athletes or talk to athletes that are lost today, and what really resonates with me, and probably was a really powerful reminder, was that football back then was my identity. So when a player gets injured now and is removed from the training environment, they somewhat momentarily lose their identity. Yeah. And I think it's hard for them to grasp that at a point in time, particularly high-level athletes that are getting paid, considerable amounts of money and also rely heavily on that as their career. You understand how it can happen. And, I'm only really talking in a sporting sense. But, once you remove yourself from something that you love, that's something that you've become connected to, that somewhat builds your identity, or, you're related to or you're associated to, but suddenly you're removed from it, in the sense that your capacity to be able to engage in it is somewhat now being forcibly stopped. For whatever reason, is hard.
You see that time and time again, just with athletes when they go through maybe like a really tough injury, and it's been their whole life, and then as soon as it happens, it's like they don't know what to do, they don't know who they are. And I guess part of the solution is not defining yourself through the sport and I guess finding more purpose and direction outside of sport and then channeling that into what you're doing, which is what it sounds like what you do for your athletes through the experiences and the upbringing that you've had.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really delicate, sensitive process now, particularly in this day and age.
Yeah.
And it's more to do with the messaging and probably just the style of communication too. I think by virtue, and I'm not just talking from a strength and conditioning coaching in general, I think now you have to become a bit more of a nurturing-based coach or, a relationship. Certainly that's probably the buzzword is a relationship-based coach where you're building really strong understanding of your athletes through trust and mutual understanding. And also allowing the athlete to build autonomy to make their own decisions as well, but also understanding that there's an obligation there and responsibility to the team, and whether that's with you as a coach or with the actual team. Versus, back then it was very command style or authoritarian style.
Yeah, it's changing a lot.
Yeah, and it's very direct. And I think we're quite dismissive a lot of the stuff, and more often than not, that type of discussion wasn't necessarily accepted in a sporting environment, deal with it in your own time type mentality, whereas now that's now widely accepted as part of your holistic approach to performance is to, let's talk about it in the sporting environment. Let's bring it into the workplace and let's talk about it, because what you do here is going to directly impact in how you perform on the court or on the field. So, it's great, I think, absolutely. I still think we've got a long way to go. There's still a lot of athletes that struggle a lot of the time with that, whether they're equipped with the skill set to manage it through their own personal experiences with their families or within their families or their own network of friends and support. But ultimately, when an athlete comes into an environment, the process these days is to sit them down and have a really meaningful chat about what they want in life and, what drives them. And, you're really sort of digging deep into terms of why are you here and what is it that you really want. So
is that your starting point when you work with someone, to really just get a sense of why are we here together? What do you want out of this? What are your goals? What are your visions? And how can we create a map to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think by my own nature, depends on who you talk to. I'd like to think I'm a genuinely caring guy.
Yeah, that comes through.
Very
authentically.
Yeah, and I make a really concerted effort to show compassion because I know what it's like to not have compassion. Yeah. I know what it's like to not feel cared for, and that really drives me. That makes me want to really engage in that. I want to know you, man.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that. I really want to have a really cool conversation about who you are, what you are, because you've got a really fascinating story. Everyone has a fascinating story. And a lot of those stories are the reasons why you're here in front of us, in front of me, about to engage in something that you really love at the highest possible level. So let's talk about it. Let's chat about it. And you listen with intent and you listen with a really open mind about who that individual is. And this is all about the power of connection. I also, like I said from the start, is I allow them to have a bit of an understanding who I am. I think that's really important, not just from a coaching perspective. These are my standards and this and that. That's all pretty much standard stuff. But, what adds a more pertinent layer to that, where the athlete may think, this guy's genuinely serious about me, is I'll explain to them, look, this is my situation. The reason I'm here today is because of, and it's not about me, by the way, but it's more about I'm on the same trajectory as you are in terms of trying to achieve the best you possibly can through physics. I'm here to help you, and I'll give everything I possibly have to help you.
Yeah, I'm hearing you. I feel like that's when you can actually make some really good breakthroughs when working with someone, when you're vulnerable, when you're really sharing some personal things and you're listening and you actually care about them, and that comes through and they feel that trust. That's when you can start to have some of the breakthroughs where they realize something about themselves or a pattern that they're repeating that they can actually change. And I think the coaching player relationship starting to change, where it's just creating a space for that to happen naturally and not forcing anything or commanding as much and being very authoritative like it has been in the past.
Yeah. And look, it is a skill set, I think. I think it's also the morphology of the individual as well in terms of, what their makeup is. And we're not psychologists, certainly not that, but what we are and what we need to be are good listeners as coaches. I'm in a really fortunate and privileged role because I'm sort of the middle person between the coach and the players. So, if I build that trust early with a player, more often than not, they're going to talk to you about their biggest concerns about performance or something perhaps even more deeper than that. And so, when you're talking to the coach, you may be able to provide some level of input in terms of the vulnerabilities of that athlete, the strengths and weaknesses, and if not, the opportunities that those athletes actually present. And this may just add to the coach having a little bit more of a broader understanding because, you got to understand, particularly in teams, the coach has a huge responsibility tactically and technically and then obviously trying to balance the emotional stability of the team to actually perform and do what they're required to do, and that's ultimately win. So the coach is preoccupied with that, but whatever information through the relationship, the trust that I have with the athlete, I can pass that on, perhaps as a tool to help that coach connect or at least understand how they may approach that particular athlete that may well be struggling or may well just sometimes need to kick up the pants. And, that's been really, as they say, emotionally intelligent or emotionally engaged, if you will, to what's going on. Look, don't get me wrong, you still got to have a strong fundamental core set of values about how you want to perform and how you want to coach. Yeah, right?
Absolutely.
So there are certainly limitations. It's more to do with the bandwidth of allowance of what you're actually willing to work with, but also what are you willing not to. And look, I'm the first to put my hand up. Sometimes that bandwidth gets quite stretched.
Absolutely. Finding that balance and working with that bandwidth is quite challenging because especially when you're coming from a empathetic and compassionate place and someone's maybe not meeting those standards, it's sometimes you do have to give the kick up the arse, but how do you actually give that kick up the arse? And there's a way to deliver that depending on who you're dealing with. And that needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely.
So from all these experiences, you got yourself into a really good gig working with the Australian Davis Cup team. So how did that all come about? And I'd love to just know about that whole experience and what it was like working with Australia's best tennis players and being in that pocket.
Yeah. When it started to happen, and what I mean by start, when the discussion started to happen that I was going to get involved with the Davis Cup, for me it was an awesome opportunity for starters. But in saying that, it was probably a product of many years of hard work around building a skill set that was conducive to being able to support athletes at the top end. And I didn't set out to have a career in tennis. I really didn't. What I did set out, though, is to work with high-performance athletes for them to be part of something special, whether it's winning a championships, grand finals, grand slam, whatever the sport is. So for me, when I started at Tennis Australia back in 2011, and I just came from SASI, and I liked tennis. And the opportunity at that particular time was more around do the best I could, and with that, opportunities will present itself. So for me, it was, I guess, essentially core business. Connect with the athletes, do the programming, lead the athletes, and do that to the best of my capacity and abilities. And by virtue of that, over time, I was then, given the opportunity to move to Melbourne to fill the role of the National Academy, and that was 2013 it might have been. The AIS had sort of decommissioned, or I shouldn't say decommissioned, more or less sort of restructured a lot of the support platforms for some of the major sports, particularly tennis. The AIS program for both men and women was based out of Canberra. The AIS at that particular point decided to put the onus back on the NSOs, the National Sporting Organisations, to take responsibility for running their own high performance performance functions. And so by virtue of that, the opportunity came up to sort of fill that role with Tennis Australia out of Melbourne Park. Mm-hmm. So my family and I, we moved over to Melbourne, and I started working immediately with Alex Bolt and Luke Saville. I'd previously worked with Luke, being South Australian. He'd come over to Adelaide every now and then. I'd work with him as well. And then obviously Thanasi was over there. He had a little bit of a different setup. And then Nick to some degree. So all these athletes that were part of the AIS program had moved over to Melbourne, where the National Tennis Academy was, I guess, formally set up, both for the boys and girls, or men and women. And so after about a year or two, Aaron Kellett, who was my direct supervisor at the time, it was a great support to me. He'd been involved in the Australian cricket team academy, and so he had a wealth of experience and knowledge, and we had a really good working relationship. And he was actually working in the Davis Cup space at that particular time. And then there was a bit of a restructure, organisational structure within Tennis Australia, and probably, if anything, a philosophical structure. And what they wanted to do really, I guess, was sort of streamline a lot of the performance programs, pathway programs. And through that process, Aaron decided to move on. And so that opportunity to be in the Davis Cup space presented itself. And I was very fortunate by that stage to have already worked with Lleyton, particularly in his last 2 years, along with his other trainer. And I was more or less just, I guess, filling the gaps with Lleyton when he was in Melbourne. He spent a lot of his time up in Sydney. So I had a really good relationship with Lleyton, and I admired Lleyton for who he was and the athlete that he was, and particularly the successes that he had. And so, I remember one day with Lleyton, we'd all admired Lleyton, particularly if you're a tennis fan, to have Lleyton sort of come up to the gym and, say, Boobs, which is my nickname, he said, take me for a session, throw everything at me. So, okay. And you're sort of a little bit reluctant, oh, hell, I don't want to injure you, but how much do I give you? And he just said, mate, you just dish out whatever you've got. So I remember we went to the back of the MCG, and I'd done a couple of boxing sessions, and I got into Lleyton, and it was good fun. And Lleyton's great. He doesn't give anything away. You think, is he really working hard? I know for a fact that I was absolutely giving everything I got in these boxing sessions, because I was gassing, but he just gave nothing away. I thought, man, this guy, it's true what they say about it. Like, he is unbelievable, just his work rate and his focus. So anyway, I thought, let's try something different. So, and I think it might have been coming into second to last season, and he just came down from Sydney and sort of rang up, and we planned a session together, and I took him just to the back of the MCG there, and there's this sort of road. And I said, all right, mate, what do you want to do? And this is prior to us going back then. He said, no, I want to do a bit of running. And all right, so I took him out, and we did these 10 100-metre hill sprints. Then we did these 100-metre running backwards with medicine balls, and just a whole heap of old school stuff. And, and Lleyton like that. And again, that's me. That's not the scientific way. That's, this, you're talking to a Grand Slam former world number one champion of the sport. You listen, but he knew his body as well as anyone. So I just dished out whatever he was prepared to do. And so there we are at the back of the MCG. I'm absolutely trying to crush him, and he's just unbelievable. So, that was a really, really good experience. And that's how, I guess, Lleyton and I sort of built that relationship. And then once this opportunity came up, and Jason Stoltenberg had just been appointed as head of professional tennis for men, and I worked really closely with Jace. And so Jason and I moved into that Davis Cup space. Jason was the head coach, Lleyton was the captain, and then I became the strength and conditioning coach. So, yeah, my first Davis Cup was, I think, it would have been against Slovenia, maybe, like Slovakia, out at Homebush there.
Yep.
On grass. We had Bernard and Nick, and it might have been, who else would have been? Thanasi might have been in there. Jordan Thompson, I think, made his debut. John Peers. So, it was a fantastic crew. And it was a really great environment to be around, lots of energy, a lot of history, and Lleyton's all about tradition and history. So, you know, if you grew up with tennis, particularly in the 80s and 90s, you know, watching Lleyton and those guys before him, Rafter and even Wayne Arthurs and all of those guys, it was just a surreal feeling to be a part of it. But at the same time, I also felt that I had an obligation to sort of uphold the standard and what values that Davis Cup was about, and that's about working hard. You know, you had Roachy out there as well doing his 2-on-1s, you know, and just watching old Roach and just getting to know Roach a little bit at the dinners and just being around the court. It was unreal.
What a cool experience that would have been. Was there anyone that really stood out to you for different reasons in terms of like what they brought to every session or how they trained and what made them, I guess, really at the most elite level?
Yeah, look, I think Lleyton being Lleyton and you know, Lleyton wanted to bring a level of relentlessness into it. Be relentless, win at all costs, you know, fight with grit, you know, all those real hardcore training values that no doubt separates, you know, the best from the rest type thing. So, you know, he brought players in like John Millman. You know, you had super talent, obviously, in Nick and Thanassian, and 1 year in Belgium we had Alex Popper in there. We had Alex de Minaur. And look, the two athletes in my mind that really sort of epitomised not necessarily their skill, but just their whole attitude was certainly Millman. Just his work rate, his ethics around what it meant for him. And don't get me wrong, all those boys and everyone, support staff included, it meant a lot to be in that Davis Cup space, but you could see, particularly with Millman and Alex de Minaur.
Yeah.
Alex was a young guy coming through. I'd previously spent about a year or so on the road with him as an underager coming through, and that's, you know, that was an amazing experience. To see where Alex today is doesn't surprise me, or probably for that matter, surprise anyone else where he's at right now. But they were the two that really stood out, and the reason why I think they stood out is, one, because of their whole attitude towards their want to represent Australia, what the tradition of the Davis Cup meant to them. And they had no doubt their own reasons as well. But you knew what you were getting out of those two each and every time.
I think that's really obvious just from the outside. You can say that those would be two guys that would epitomise really high quality, just attitude and work rate and getting the absolute most out of themselves. That maybe people that aren't the most naturally talented, but they're going a really long way in maximising what they have just through that sheer attitude. And when I see a kid or anyone that I work with that has that, I just know that they're going to be great at whatever they do, whether they continue on the tennis path or wherever they go in their life, they continue with that sort of attitude. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. Like, and you know, the thing that stood out with Alex de Minaur was, this was a young guy, and I was very fortunate. I was actually in Vancouver 1 year at a Challenger event, and I got a phone call from, might have been Pat, about going down and playing a support role to young Alex and Alex Popper at the time down in Washington. It was a lead-up tournament, Grade 1, leading into the US Open Juniors. And at that point, I think one of the coaches fell sick or had to go back to Australia, and I was probably the only TA employee that was available. There were others, but I think that were available in their schedules to actually be able to fly down and just provide a bit of a duty of care, because they were both under 18 at the time. So I went down there, and what really struck me impressively about Alex was just his maturity at that point. As a 16, 17-year-old, he took ownership. He was, you know, really clear on what he wanted to do and really respectful. And just the language he used was all positive, but it was mostly geared around, how do I get better? He asked questions. He was inquisitive about the whys of what I did. And look, I came in without not knowing Alex, to be honest. I'd heard of him. I'd sort of seen him from a distance at some junior tournaments. But when I actually had that privilege now to actually be in front of him and actually spend a whole week with him, you could tell that this kid was going places, and he had a real personal story behind it, one that I dare not share. That's for him to share. And you could see that he had a real burning desire to be the best he possibly could. And it wasn't about being the best in the world. I think being the best he would take him to be the best in the world, and that's what really impressed me. So I watched him actually play Shapovalov, it might have been, or Felix in the semi-final, and it was one of the greatest junior matches I've ever seen. Just the fight between these two, and just the level was incredible. Alex unfortunately lost, but that whole week, you look at the list now of who was in that tournament. You had Shapovalov, you had Felix, you had Alex, obviously, Popperin in there, and there's probably one or two others I can't quite recall at this point, but I remember just watching the level across all of those matches going, hey, this is the future right here. And I think that year Alex goes on to play, he might have gone on to make Wimbledon final. So then to see him, a year or so later in Davis Cup space, and he's just like a sponge. He was just absorbing everything. And you talk about standout moments, perhaps even a breakthrough moment, and it wasn't necessarily during a tournament. It was actually at a camp. So we just finished up, it might have been 2016-17. We just finished up the US Open, and it was actually the year that we played Belgium in the semi-final of Davis Cup in Belgium, and we were at the US Open, and there was this camp. And this camp was at the John McEnroe Tennis Centre, and it was indoor clay, partly because we were playing indoor clay in Belgium. And I think Alex might have been an orange boy, I'm not sure, or he was just part of the squad. Either way, Lleyton wanted him there because of his passion and his energy, and he, no doubt he could see something in him. And so Alex is playing points out of hand with Nick. And Nick, obviously, at that time was, in a world of his own in terms of just, stratosphere, like tennis was unbelievable. And so his level was naturally high. And then Alex here, you got this guy, you either thought he's trying to make a really good impression or this guy is genuinely, seriously good. And I remember they were playing points out of hand, and Nick couldn't brush him aside. Like, it was, I think it might have been to 21. It was like 19 all. Like, I mean, his level just switched, and you go, holy crap. Like, his level just went up a notch, and which hadn't been there previously. It was good, don't get me wrong, but went up against Nick, and to be able to match Nick, and Nick, no doubt, was, unhinged at all. He was just all out. And so and then to the point where Nick said, let's go again.
Because Nick's still a fierce competitor. Like, people misunderstand him in that sense. He is a fierce competitor and does not want to lose to anybody. Absolutely
right. And, you talk about Nick. I mean, I was fortunate to have spent some time with Nick in two different phases of his career as a 15, 16-year-old. Not necessarily directly working with him, but certainly around the environment that we were in. And then probably three phases. When he had that breakout against Rafa, he came back probably 6 months later. Certainly a different person, no doubt, which was unsurprising. And then obviously when I was in the Davis Cup space as well. So I was privileged to see Nick sort of, emerge as this raw super talent at 15 to, Davis Cup, a servant to, doing what he's doing now. So from a distance, I guess, watching him now. But what I really, Nick is misunderstood, and I'm only just talking from the experiences, and I respect Nick. Look, no doubt, he's volatile, and that's what makes him unique. I think, what he has is this amazing desire, deep desire to really compete. So when he needs to flick the switch, he can flick the switch, and I was very privileged to see a lot of that. And some of the stuff he does on court is just phenomenal. Like, you just sit there and in awe of, oh, man, this guy is unbelievable. So, and Nick does work hard, don't get me wrong. Nick in his own mind, no doubt, has a real high work ethic of when he wants to. Mm-hmm. So, and I think a lot of, particularly the public, they don't see that. Yeah. And I did a couple of pre-seasons with Nick, and when he wants to work, he can work. So, yeah, look, you sort of, as probably no doubt anyone that has worked with Nick, you sort of sit back and see it from a distance now and you go, oh, Nick, what are you doing? But then on the other side, you understand what he's going through. I mean, he's an exceptional talent. So good luck to him.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I always wish him the best. Are there any, so when you're doing some standard tests like beep test or 20-meter sprint, can you give anyone that's listening kind of a benchmark of what these guys are doing at that level with a beep test score to kind of give us a sense of where they're at that level and where we need to get to if we want to get closer to that elite level.
Yeah, look, the testing modalities or the battery test that we used for tennis is, look, at the end of the day, it's, in my opinion, it probably needs to be specific to the type of player. But if you're talking in a sort of an academy environment where you need to test holistically the group, then the beep test is a great standardizer. So when we were at Tennis Australia, when I was at Tennis Australia, we rolled out the beep test, and someone like Jordan Thompson hit 15s. But then you look at his game style and he's a counter puncher. And so his game is built on repetitiveness. His game is built on endurance. So his work rate and his work capacity needs to be high. Yeah. Same with the Blake Mott. I also got to about 220. He ran a 15. But then you look at guys like perhaps Thanasi might not necessarily have the high capacity as Tomo in the beat test, and he might run a 12-13, but that doesn't necessarily say he's a bad athlete. At the end of the day, really it's just a measure of cardiovascular or aerobic power potential more than anything, or at least where they currently sit at that point in time. So for me, I don't take too much out of it. If you really want to talk specifics, you can probably design one test I used to run with the guys, the repeat 10 up, 10 back, 20 metre up, 20 metre back test. So what that has is the speed element to it, but also the change of direction element to it, which is critical in tennis as well.
Yeah, Minaur would be an absolute beast at that one. Off the charts, right?
Yeah, speed, His repetitive nature to be able to move from static to in range and back is phenomenal, and then that's just his natural genetic makeup.
Yeah, for sure.
And he's a light frame. But no doubt, I look at him now and he's certainly filled out since when I worked with him, and that's natural and that's expected. And look, I don't know what his current training regime is, but I always knew that Alex really thrived and felt that he got the best out of himself when he was doing a lot of running, intervals. And I think one key to remember if you're a developing athlete, not every tennis player needs to run. It's each to their own. It's very individualistic. But if you do decide to run, get a qualified coach to actually be able to prescribe, because you got to try and avoid over injuries or overuse injuries.
Absolutely. Is there any advice that you would give on recovery or things in that realm to help back up performance? Obviously, tennis players are training twice a day at that level, and day after day, there's really not many days off. What do you recommend in terms of recovery and those sort of tools to keep going and backing up?
Yeah, look, I think there's two elements to recovery. There's the physiological aspects of recovery, the windows of recovery. So, we talk about replacing electrolytes and refueling, certainly protein intake within the first 6, 12, 24 hours. So understanding that side of recovery is really important to refuel, I guess, more or less, making sure that you replace lost fluids and you replenish depleted protein. And so, taking and carbohydrates for that matter, particularly if it's been a hard training session. So understanding that, but that doesn't necessarily mean what works for one individual will work for another. I'd certainly advise getting some nutrition advice on that from a qualified dietitian or a nutritionist. So that would be the physiological aspect of it in terms of just from a nutrition perspective. I guess then there's the emotional, mental side of it, just being able to decompress, especially after a loss. The physical side of it, we talk about doing ice baths. Yep, absolutely. Again, there's a certain window for that. There's active recovery, whether it's sitting on a bike, which a lot of athletes do.
Yeah, that's become really common now.
Yeah, and the whole idea of that is to sort of, unload the lactate that's being built up to sort of stop the crystallization of muscle or the stiffness onset, which naturally results in DOMS, delayed onset of muscle soreness. And because the key is, particularly in tournaments, is to be able to back it up again. So each athlete may choose to do a passive recovery, whether it's on a bike or a swim or a walk or just foam roll for that matter. And then sleep. Sleep is perhaps the biggest one, and that's the ability to be able to just switch off. It's very difficult, particularly if you're playing late at night, and I get that. But perhaps within that 24 hours, being able to program some sleep time in there, and I'm not talking 3 hours sleep. Certainly there's enough evidence to suggest that a 10, 15-minute power nap during the day is quite effective, but also making sure that you get your 8 to 10 hours sleep at night as well, and creating a really good environment for you to be able to do that as an athlete is really important. And it's easier said than done, particularly when you're touring. So exposing yourself to light is not ideal in that sense. So just where you can switch off mentally as well, emotionally, being able to go to bed and fall to sleep as quick as you can is probably a really important critical factor in the recovery process.
Yeah, I think that's really important advice, and being able to, no matter where you are, traveling around the world and touring, just finding a structure and a system to be able to keep those habits going is, I think, going to give you a breeding ground to be really consistent in your performance and successful. Yep. So all of these experiences, I mean, you've worked with, amazing athletes, you've experienced so many cool things, and it's only recently that you really have created this foundation called Project 6, and it's really to help out disadvantaged kids in the Philippines, which is what we were touching on earlier, which is connected to your upbringing and how you came over from the Philippines as a young boy. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this came about and what's this all about and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, as I was saying from the very beginning, my whole life has been around, I guess, finding a true identity. And that identity is more about understanding where I came from. And in some respects, the why. Why did I come from there and how did I end up here? And by virtue of that, I've built this, I guess, sense of gratitude and appreciation, not just through experiencing, understanding that, but also through what my adoptive mother did. She was involved in a foundation or a charity when I was growing up, and she was a sponsorship manager, and her work was around raising funds to support underprivileged children in the Philippines, support them through medical support, education, and she raised a significant amount of money over the years, and to the point where she was able to bring children over for craniofacial surgery here in Adelaide, and she was able to do that by connecting with a very prominent surgeon here in South Australia, in Adelaide. So she left this legacy. Unfortunately, that legacy of hers was never really fulfilled, and as part of that tragic experience of her passing away, one of my promises to her was that one day I would continue that in some
amazing
form or shape. And so in 2017, as I was sort of going through this somewhat identity crisis, I'll call it a really heavy reflection period time. And so in a nutshell, basically, I took my family over to the Philippines for the very first time as a family. My wife and my son, Jensen, who happened to be 4.5 years old, ironically or coincidentally the same age that I was when I was adopted as well. And I have this really vivid memory of him standing in front of the orphanage, and it just brought back all these somewhat memories, whatever memories I did have, but the feelings. And I had just had this huge appreciation for the life I'd lived. And that for me was probably the start of me wanting to do something, which I guess really then opened that door of repaying my mother's promise, or fulfilling my mother's promise of one day continuing her work. And I immediately, when I was there, was what can I do to help? I remember from the orphanage to the administration office, which was only about 20 metres, I was just frantically thinking, I've got to do something. And I was thinking, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a builder, I don't have those particular skill sets. And just as I got into the door of the administration office, I sort of looked out the window and I saw a basketball court, and immediately I said I could probably offer coaching support, if not sporting equipment. So I asked the question literally right there, what physical activity or what sports equipment do you have or don't you have, or what sports equipment do you require? And she said, we need everything. But we don't know if we can service it because we can't afford to get a coach, but certainly we could do some basketballs. The basketball court was decrepit, mind you, and there was no basketball ring. The court was there. So immediately I made a pledge to say, right, I'm going to donate some basketballs. And then I said, look, immediately I made the decision then to say I'm going to come back and donate some more equipment. And so I left the orphanage with that in mind. And for a couple of days, I thought, how can I do this? I really want to do this. And then I thought, well, probably the best way to do it, if I'm genuinely serious about it, is to commit to setting up a foundation charity. And I wanted to do it right. I didn't want it to be a flash in the pan. So I really planned it. I spoke to a lot of people, and I really wanted to define its function, more importantly. And so from there, I established Project 6, which is the district, Project 6 in the Philippines, in Quezon City. And then I guess the next part of that was to identify how I could actually do that, and that was through the provision of providing sports equipment. So I started to raise money to get tennis equipment over naturally. And then the next part to that was to actually find people to service it. So the first thing I thought of, let's go over there as a coaching group firstly to sort of almost launch it. And so I was very lucky, very fortunate to have Andrew Whittington come over, who was a tennis player who I'd worked with, and really great support, and he had a lot of, I guess, time for what I was trying to do and wanted to be part of it. So I was more than happy. And then another guy called Brett McClellan, who was a under 14s Tennis Australia coach for boys, who I had a previous relationship with when I was at Tennis Australia here in Adelaide. And Brett was really passionate about the project that I was proposing to him, and so the three of us went over there. In fact, I actually first did it with Blake Mott and Brett firstly. So in our first year, I took Blake Mott back there and we ran some clinics and donated a whole bunch of equipment. And then in the second year, I took Andrew over there, and it's probably the second year that I said I'm going to really commit to this for the rest of my life.
Oh, wow.
And so we started to put things in place, and it started to gain momentum. Unfortunately, COVID struck, and that sort of set us back for a couple of years. But the whole purpose, and certainly the whole foundation of what the charity is built on, is on allowing kids to build an identity within themselves, delivering a level of hope through sports, in the sense that sports can provide connection, gives them a little bit of direction and purpose, and understanding a skill set and teaching them those skills, the social integration of it all. But on a broader level, it's the narrative I've always wanted to talk about and want to be spoken about in years to come, is that if we can implement this program across multiple communities within orphanages and youth detention centres and elementary schools in these sort of impoverished areas, the narrative is that one day, hopefully, that I will bump into one of these young people that years ago had experienced our programs, and they found so much joy in it. They learned a lot, allowed them to connect, and then from there, we were able to go off and achieve the things that they wanted to achieve, and that's, have a family of their own, get a job, and then hopefully give back to their own community. So for me, that is the narrative I want to hear perhaps in 5-10 years' time. And there's a long way to go. It's an ambitious one, but I'm confident that just through commitment alone and a desire to really connect with that project, in time that narrative will be told. I think the first step was to build the respect, though, within those communities. What you find in a lot of those impoverished areas, that everyone wants to do their part. I wanted to be genuine and authentic about it. I wanted to really demonstrate that I was genuinely serious about helping them. So I went over there with the intent to just earn their respect. So I gave it everything I had with Andrew and Blake Mott in those previous years, along with Brett, that we really went out of our way, happily went out of our way to just do what we could to give the kids a really good experience, but importantly, build that trust within those communities to the point now where I just came back from a tour about 10 days ago, which is where I Coach for Smiles tour, where I this time took over some Australian Rules footballers from the Glenelg Football Club here. And we went over and ran a whole bunch of footy clinics, but also I ran some fitness clinics as well with tennis. And then we went and visited all the orphanages that we had partnerships with and just donated a lot of the equipment that we had donated to us through our generous supporters. So, and just to listen to the kids and listen to the welfare staff talk about how much this means to them, but more importantly, how much this just helps them enjoy their experiences, because particularly in the orphanage, a lot of these kids don't have much hope.
Yeah. This is amazing, Daniel. Like, a lot of people talk about giving back, and I guess people are not happy with government's involvement, and they wish the government could do more, and they're always talking about other people doing something. But look at you, you've just, through your experience, you're actually being part of the change that you want to see in the world and giving back to these kids that, you have a connection through your change and your upbringing. And I think that's really inspiring for people to go, you can actually do something, you can actually be part of the change. And I think it's a really inspiring message for people here. And I'd love to hear more about how it's actually changed you as an individual, like how you've changed through the experiences of giving back in the last year since starting the foundation.
I think that's a really good question. I think the whole experience of, there's the personal experience, and I guess the personal experience is to reconnect from a heritage point of view, but then there's the greater connection of giving back to the community. Naturally, there's a lot of meaning to it for me, and what it has impacted me on is just my outlook towards the challenges that I may face in life. It's also taught me to become a little more connected to the moment, and not get caught up on the small things, which a lot of people will say, but also it really wants me to. It's allowing me to connect more with people on a more meaningful level. That's something that I've really wanted to do. I have this philosophy that, particularly with the charities, that particularly when it comes to physical activity, you shouldn't have to pay for it. Like, to be able to inspire someone to go outside and have some fun should not cost money. But in saying that, there's elements that you can layer in there that can also not only allow them to go outside and be active, but also teach them skills, and that's by providing sports equipment. So my whole philosophy is around about making sure that these kids have it, but importantly that I connect with it and really encourage the kids to be in that moment. And that's where you got to give yourself a lot. I don't ask for anything. Absolutely don't ask. I don't ask for anything in return from anyone that I take over, other than just be yourself, give your time up. But I really want the people that, and that's the other thing too. The whole idea of the foundations is not about me. It's not about my story. Whilst the story helps to connect the meaning of it, it's about the children, it's about the communities, but it's also about the coaches that I take on with me. I want them to have that experience of being able to give back and using, I guess, the foundation as a vehicle for them to do that in their most natural, expressive way. And so I did that with these, and I want young people to do that, where, and we talked a bit about it earlier, that some young people feel a little bit lost. I see, I'm a bit older these days, and I feel as a coach as well, I've always seen that as a responsibility to help impact children and young people through providing them experiences with mentorship, guidance, and that's what I want this foundation to be able to do, is give those opportunities to young people to say, come and be yourself, but also give back and be in the moment over there. So I took these 2 young footballers over there, and I said to them before, I said, look, we're going to go to pretty harsh places. You're going to see a whole range of things. Don't be deceived by what you see. It's the real world. You could be in one suburb that looks like Sydney, and then within a suburb later, not far away from there, you'll be right in the thick of a third world country. And we saw a lot of that, and it was really interesting sort of listening on some of the conversations that was taking place between these 2 young lads, and they said, I can't believe this is real. I said, mate, it is real. This is what unfortunately is presented in this life, in this reality. So, and I said, look, we can't fix problems. These are out of our control, but what we can do is make an effort.
Yeah,
and that's all I ask for, is you make an effort to really appreciate and give it your all. And they came out of that tour with one of the best experiences, but it's just not that. I don't want them just to feel good. I want them to take some lifelong learnings from that. So for me, that's one of the other objectives of the foundation, is to provide young people that platform.
Yeah, it's so true what you're saying. I think because we grow up in such good circumstances here, we often forget how lucky we are in some ways. And if we can remind ourselves how lucky we are and to take on these opportunities, which you've been talking about throughout this podcast, I think it's going to help us out a lot. And when we can, giving back. And what's really speaking to me through this conversation is just your authentic nature through it all, your passion to really be of service, your passion to really give back, and listen to people and help the athlete or whoever's in front of you with their needs. And I think it's a really inspiring message for anyone, any parent, any coach, or anyone looking to help out or provide some service to the youth, or just anyone in general. So I feel like there's so many key takeaways today, and it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to your story. And I'm inspired myself to be a better person, be a better coach, and give back where I can. And I guess what I want to wrap up with is there a way that we can give to your organization? Anyone listening, is there like a link, or is there a way to donate? Because I would love to, through ATA, to give back in some small way, and how we can. How do people access that? Is that something that you do? Well,
firstly, mate, thanks for having me on today. It's been a real privilege to be able to sit here in the comfort of you and the presence of you, and to talk about my experiences. So I really appreciate that, and thanks for giving me the airtime, mate. For people that are interested potentially in the foundation and helping us out, they can visit the foundation's website on P6, as in the number 6f.org. Mm-hmm. So that's www.p6f.org, no AU, and there's a donate link on the top toolbar that they'll be able to link on and make a donation. But if anyone actually wants to physically get involved, by all means they can contact me from the website, and I'd be more than happy to have a chat.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Thanks again. This has been an absolute pleasure.
No, pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.